Hey there, Show and Tellerinos. It's time for another episode of Comic Show and Tell with Nat Gertler. And our special surprise host this time is, well, me, Nat Gertler. That's not much of a surprise. My name is right there in the title. I've written comics. I've written about comics. I've published comics, including some books of comics from old black newspapers. And with Black History Month coming up, well, I thought about making sure that I had an episode on relevant history, but hey, my first two episodes were about obscure early black superheroes from black creators, so if I didn't cover something on topic this month, I wouldn't feel too guilty about it. But while the black newspapers are great, there's something to be said about black representation in mainstream papers. And when we talk about black characters, of course, we'll mention Franklin, the character who integrated Peanuts. And he has an extra special place for me because a dear and alas departed friend of mine, Harriet Glickman, was the person who recommended to Schultz that he add a black character to the strip and got some of her black friends to do the same, which led to the introduction of Franklin. And his first appearance in 1968 was a major event covered in the news of the day because Peanuts was a major success and Franklin was being treated as an equal. Not like some of the black characters that would occasionally show up briefly in other strips, often as servants. But while Franklin was important because of the scale of attention, his occasional appearances didn't exactly make Peanuts the first integrated strip. I'm sure that some of you, particularly those in my age range, remember another kid's strip, Wee Pals. Wee Pals was created in 1965 by a black creator, Maury Turner, and he actually created it at the suggestion of the guy who would later bring Franklin to the funnies page, Charles Schultz. It featured a purposely racially broad cast. The strip was a success. It got turned into an animated series. And if you read the Wikipedia page on it, you'll see it's first comic strip syndicated in the United States to have a cast of diverse ethnicity. And if you check, say, the Oakland Tribune's announcement of the strip's launch, it will explain to you that what makes the strip integrated is it's about a white youngster and his Negro pal. But what if I was to tell you that there was an earlier comic strip featuring, as title characters, a white guy and his African American pal? Let's say it came 10 years before Wee Pals. That would make some sense because that would be the 1950s and we'd have the integration to schools and Brown versus the Board of Education and all kinds of stuff like that going on. So it makes some sense. Or what if I just say it was 20 years earlier? So now we're getting World War II era. We've just been fighting the fascist racists in Europe, and symbolically that would be a good, interesting thing. That would make some sense. But what if I started talking about 40 years earlier? Now, that wouldn't seem to make sense, and yet we're talking about a strip that not only ran 40 years earlier, but was still running when Wee Pals started. And yet, you've probably never heard of it. So let's fix that. But one thing I should note is that if you've done the math, now we're talking the 1920s. And 1920s cartoon depictions of black people are not good. And this applies not only to whatever appearances they would make in the standard daily newspapers, even some of the strips in the black newspapers have caricature styles that would not be viewed as appropriate today, and in often cases were not viewed as appropriate at the time. If you look at some early animation that have black characters, yeah, you get what I'm going to. So if this will make you uncomfortable, I understand if you want to drop out of this video now, hit the subscribe button so that you can come back and see me when I'm talking about something less sensitive. And while you're at it, hit the like button. Oh, and one other thing I should note is, in case it's not totally clear, I am not a black person. In fact, I am notably pale. So anything I have to say about racial matters will be tainted by my own perspective, and certainly other people may view it differently. If that's going to bother you, again, click subscribe, click like, and I'll see you next time. For those who stuck around, let's get into history. We're going to start with a strip called Joe Quince, which first appeared in April 9, 1923. Some sources will tell you it started in 1924, but ignore those. The ads from the time announce that it's about a guy who gets an inheritance. And indeed he does. In the very first strip, he gets $3,000. Now, even then, $3,000 wouldn't make you a millionaire. In today's money, it'd be $50,000, $60,000. Nice to get, but it wouldn't make you set for life. Still, it was enough for him to quit his low-end job as a department store clerk. In the second day of the strip, a black man is introduced. Joe is using his money to stay at a fancy hotel, the Ritz Astoria, where there's a short bellhop who will eventually learn is named Mose. He shows up a few times at the hotel, but Joe has to leave because he managed to invest away his fortune. This really gets us to the basic driver of the strip, with Joe as someone who feels he's entitled to wealth and is just a few easy investments, easy bets, easy whatevers away from being flush. At the end of May, he sees a chance to make a score if he can just convince people he's rich. He brings Mose in on the scheme, at first very against his will, but eventually convinces Mose to play the part of his valet, his manservant, to create the illusion of wealth, with a promise to cut Mose in on the windfall once it comes. Joe and Mose are together for a while, with Mose transforming into a boxer and Joe his manager, all in efforts to raise cash from nothing. But all this time, it's Joe Quince's name in the title. Mose is not the character we're looking for. After a few months, he fades from view in the strip. Joe starts representing another fighter, a large Eskimo, as they said then, named Moko. Then, in April 1924, something weird happened to the Joe Quince strip. There started being two versions of it. There was the standard version, which ran in every paper but one, and then there was the version that ran in the Baltimore Sun. It was custom made for the paper, and in each installment, Joe and his new friend, a black man who was a gambling tipster at Pimlico, the Baltimore horse racing track. In each strip, the two of them would pick one or two horses racing at Pimlico that night, and the next day's strip would mention the real outcome of the race and keep track of their winnings. And from the second time this strip appeared, it had a new name, named after both the characters. Yes, it was Joe Quince and Asbestos? Asbestos. Well, it's not a stereotypical black character name of the time like Mose was. And you may be thinking that it's a downright insult because asbestos is that dreadful, deadly carcinogen that we have to remove from old buildings. But that's now. While there had been suspicions earlier, 1924, the year that the character asbestos first appeared, was the first year that someone's death was attributed to asbestosis. So in the public mind, it wasn't a deadly substance, it was a fireproof substance, something that protected us all. But he may not be named for the substance asbestos. Sure, there's plenty around. In fact, there was a lot of asbestos mining in Hereford County, the county right next to Baltimore County, so it was a big thing locally to where the strips were taking place. But it was such a big thing that in 1913, the Western Maryland Railroad Company named the train station near the Baltimore Asbestos and Roofing Company, renamed it to Asbestos. So Asbestos was a stop on the railway line, and because of that, the unincorporated area around the station also became known as Asbestos. You'll see the Asbestos, Maryland address in newspaper articles for about 20 years, reaching into the 1930s, over a decade after the asbestos plant closed in Asbestos. The citizens of the area, who weren't all that happy about that, eventually got the name changed back. And now that area has a more dignified name, the Cedarhurst area in the town of Finksburg. So anyway, Asbestos the character may be named after the fibrous substance, or after the train station, or after the town, which, despite being a fairly small town, actually got national attention in 1924. Why? Because of a big fire. The national press made it sound even bigger than it was because the idea of a town named Asbestos burning to the ground was just too funny not to report. Or it could just be a name to suggest that the character is trying as best as he can. It's probably not a coincidence that Joe Quince can be read as Joke Wince. This is the same cartoonist who would give us in other strips the characters Stupid and She'll Agree. Now, when you're doing a strip just for a single local paper, you can turn it in one night and have it in the paper the next day. That let Kling build jokes around how they came up with the name of the horse at a local track to bet on. However, when other papers became interested in the betting version of the strip, this caused a problem. Syndicated strips are traditionally done about 6 weeks before they reach papers, giving them time to get to the distributor and then be distributed to the newspapers. However, the lineup for a horse race is not scheduled that far in advance. And even if they were, that would be 6 weeks full of information that could be important in picking a winning horse. So for a long while, the strips would be distributed with blank areas in the word balloons, and each day the newspaper would get a call telling them what to write in the word balloons, or as you see in this example, use type to put the information in. And yes, that's asbestos there. He's dressing to do some spying work to get inside information on a race. Here we have the original art for one of the strips, and yes, they made it really large back in the day, but yes, now this is officially a real show and tell. Anyway, here is the first panel where they would have the newspapers put how Joe and Asbestos's bets fared from the previous day and what their running annual total for winnings or losings was. So that would get there. And then in the last panel, often to be in the dialogue, in this case it's in a caption, but where it says the word mort there, that's where the newspaper would have to put the prediction for the day's race. And if you're curious, this particular example is quite misogynistic. It's about a novelty race being held with girl jockeys, and it goes badly because two of the jockeys get into a hair-pulling fight about lipstick in the middle of the race. And you can see the cover-up in the final panel where the original text said that the girls went on to arguing about clothes. By the way, if you're actually curious about how women jockeys were treated when they tried to get into the sport, now it's beyond the scope of this show, but go read the Wikipedia entry for Penny Ann Early, who holds a special place in sports history. After a while, they stopped putting the text in the cartoon itself, and all the information was put in separate panels. Both who to bet on that day and how the previous day's bet had fared. Then the strip didn't have to do with picking horses. It could just be normal comic strip stuff about the characters. Plus, it made the strip of interest to newspapers that weren't near racetracks. They could just run the strip without the added text box. The characters went on to other fundraising endeavors. Why did Kling add a second character to the strip? Well, it might help to understand where Kling came from creatively. Before he was drawing his own strips, he was an assistant to cartoonist Bud Fisher. Fisher was the creator of Mutt and Jeff, a highly successful strip of two financially lean guys who bummed around together. They played off each other well, and it seems like Kling realized that he wanted to emulate some of that chemistry. Mutt was the shorter, more active one, while Jeff was the taller, more contemplative one, though no wiser. And that was very much the way things evolved in Kling's strip, with Asbestos in the Mutt row and Joe as Jeff. And that wasn't the only thing that Kling got from Fisher. Fisher was into horse racing, so much so that he used some of the big bucks he got from his strip to buy and raise horses. He did that so well that one year he not only did he get a horse into the Preakness, one of the races in a horse racing's Triple Crown, he got two horses into that race. It was Fisher who really introduced Kling to horse racing. Fisher even had a horse named Cartoonist, and later, a horse named Ken Kling. In 1926, Kling tired of the Joe and Asbestos strip and brought it to an end, starting a new strip called Windy Riley in 1927. Windy was perhaps a bit better off than Joe Quince was, but otherwise fairly similar, even becoming a boxing manager, in his case for a caricatured Chinese boxer named Chop Mup. But while Kling was willing to let go of all the horse racing stuff, the bettors weren't willing to let go of him. You see, when Joe and Asbestos were picking horses, they actually did a pretty good job and had a winning record. According to some sources, the racing fans started looking for racing tips in the new strip, even though none were being put in. They would try to find number cues somewhere in the strip to tell them which horse to bet in which race. But it wasn't the bettors that drew Kling to bring Joe and Asbestos back. It was the newspaper magnates, most specifically the one and only William Randolph Hearst. He didn't want to win races, he wanted to sell newspapers, and he knew that racing buffs and gambling addicts could buy any paper to tell them which horses were running, but they would gladly buy a paper which told them which horses would win. So he offered Kling big bucks, and Kling brought the strip to Hearst's New York Daily Mirror, which bought a big local exclusive on the strip. Other papers near racetracks in other states bought exclusive statewide rights as well, exclusives that barred any other newspaper within a 300-mile radius from running the strip. The reincarnated version even had a Sunday strip, but not the kind of Sunday strip you're used to. Color Sunday comics were printed weeks in advance, which didn't fit well with the way Joe and Asbestos worked. Instead, the Sunday strip, which ran in the sports section like any other day, would be used to answer readers' mail and have other discussions of horse racing in block text. Was the strip's return a success? Absolutely. Not only did it make big profits in the newspapers, there was a series of film shorts, just a few of them, starring Harry Gribben and Eddie Green. And there was an attempt at a Broadway musical, although it never reached the stage. and an attempt at a radio show and a TV deal that didn't end up with a show, but the longest running tie-in to come out of the revival was a weekly bettor's tip sheet, the sort of thing that folks would buy outside of their favorite track. Launched in September 1933, the sheet ran into the 1940s, the 1950s, even into the 1960s. That's right, over 30 years. In the 1940s, Life magazine reported that it was selling 75,000 copies a week. This one here is from 1953. You can see that it cost 35 cents at the time, which at that time, for a dime, you could buy a 48-page full-color comic book instead of this one folded sheet of paper. But you needed this one folded sheet of paper if you wanted to play the ponies, because Kling started putting his predictions in the strip in code. And every week there'd be a new code, a simple substitution cipher that you had to pay 35 cents in order to figure out and know what horse you should bet on. Kling, you have to understand, was good at picking the ponies. So good that he wrote a book about it. When he was going to come out in 1948, they were prepared to put a claim on the dust jacket that for 15 straight years, Joe and asbestos had made a profit with their bets over the course of a year. The only problem was that the last year before the book was published, on December 28th, 1947, Joe and asbestos were about $100 in the hole for the year, and the publisher was about to send the book to press and wanted to just eliminate the boast. But Kling had them push the printing back, push the release of the book back, and on December 30th, Joe and asbestos hit a long shot. Kling had eked out a profit for the year, and the blurb went on the book as planned. And his picks had an impact. In 1937, it was estimated that the horses he picked got $3 million bet on them in each day. Newspaper editor Morris Markey would tell the tale of the time that the paper he was working on dropped the strip trying to save money and quickly found their circulation dropping by 5%. They got the message and restored the strip. Over the years, the strip moved to a more realistic, less cartoony look. I don't know whether it was Kling changing his own art style or if it was assistants that he had drawing the strip who were bringing something new to the page. Did Kling use assistants? Well, let me quote an article from 1943. 90% of our top comic artists employ assistants or ghosts. Some admit that their ghosts only do the lettering in the backgrounds, but in the majority of the cases, the ghosts draw the entire pictures. Some even employ ghosts to write the continuity so that all that many of the creators do is collect the dough. Does that apply to Kling himself? All I can tell you is that Kling wrote that article. The realistic drawing made matters worse in terms of the racist visual depictions of asbestos. It's not that asbestos' design changed, it's that when you have a broad cartoony style, everything is to some degree an exaggeration. We don't fault, say, the huge size of Charlie Brown's head, because Peanuts is a very cartoony, exaggerated strip. If Charlie Brown were to have more realistic features, his dimensions would be a problem. And in the early appearances of asbestos, we could think that the way he looked was an exaggeration version of something, not perhaps emphasizing the things we want to see emphasized. But what happened was that as the strip became more realistic and Joe was drawn more as a human being, the basic design of asbestos didn't change. This drawing of him became not an exaggeration, but what he actually looked like some hideous, bizarre creature, nothing human at all. His dialect had improved over the decades, but the racist visuals had not. In the 1960s, this was finally addressed. The rendering grew even more realistic, and in 1963, just as Hearst's Daily Mirror was going out of business and the strip's main home was switching to the New York Daily News, asbestos was finally, looking like a human being. Things had gotten better. Why? Well, apparently the civil rights organization Congress of Racial Equality had complained about the figure being gross and degrading. And even though this was not the first time the character had been complained about, this was the time that worked. Kling, who had grown up in Harlem, would later tell Ebony magazine that he was glad to cooperate in any way he could. But that didn't last long, as Kling brought the strip to an end in 1968, and then died in 1970. Now, there may be a few of you watching who knew of Joe and asbestos before this, but I'm guessing that most of you hadn't. I mean, you can even have a book on black images and comics that doesn't mention it, despite asbestos being the black title character of a nationally syndicated strip for 40 years. In fact, as I'm making this recording, there's not yet a page about either Ken Kling or the strip in Wikipedia. A fact which may be untrue by the time you watch this, as I'm currently working on building pages for them. Go, check, see if they're up yet. Is there a reason why it's so unfamous? Well, I can think of four. And the first one is pretty darn obvious, and that is the racial issue. While it was historically interesting that there was a strip with a black title character for so long, with an integrated sensibility, the integration only went so far. There weren't a whole lot of other black characters. There occasionally was one, but it was not the default. But also not only the visual depiction of asbestos for most of the run, but the dialect he was frequently given, and his uneven subservience to Joe. And sometimes Kling would refer to Joe as asbestos' partner, and sometimes as his boss. And with the commonality of blacks being depicted as servants in servants' professions, while they certainly did have a large role in that at the time, that is not necessarily what you want to lead with. So it's an uncomfortable strip from that aspect now. Although I will say this, asbestos was never shown as lazier, stupider, or more immoral than Joe. They're just a bunch of gamblers willing to do whatever it took to get the tip. Number two is it was a success, but it wasn't the kind of success we normally see in comic strips. We usually think about a successful strip reaching hundreds of newspapers. And in contrast, because it was bought out as an exclusive in wherever it was being carried for hundreds of miles around, it was actually in very few papers. In 1943, the strip was in 7 newspapers. Now, it was supposedly reaching about 4 million readers at the time, but that's still a small fraction of what more successful strips were reaching. Number 3 is linked to that. It may not have been reaching that many readers. It was in that many newspapers. But especially for comics fans, they're not necessarily looking on the sports page for their comics. They're looking on the comics page for their comics. So the sort of person who would carry on the history of a comic strip wasn't necessarily seeing it. Certainly there's some overlap of sports fans and comics fans, but it's far from 100%. And number 4 was there were no reprints of it. There were no reprint books. It didn't even appear in comic books. And part of that reason is it wasn't coming out through a normal syndicate. At the beginning of its run, it was through a standard syndicate. But when it went away and came back, Ken Kling was syndicating it himself to the papers. So if, say, a comic book was making a deal to reprint the strips from some syndicate, they weren't coming to Ken Kling. They were going to United Features or whoever. And there weren't any books of it. And if you think about it, that kind of makes sense. Some comic strips are practically timeless. You can read old Peanuts, and there's the occasional dial telephone, and every once in a while there's a reference to Romper Room or something that you may not understand if you weren't alive at that time. But for the most part, you can read and get the jokes and enjoy it as it was meant to be enjoyed. Some strips age over the years. Doonesbury, all of Doonesbury has come out during the time I've been alive, but I can still look at some old strips and have no idea what's going on because it's a specific reference to some political thing that was going on that was current at the time, and which I probably knew about at the time, but I have forgotten in my advancing years. However, there's probably nothing that becomes dated so quickly as a prediction on tonight's horse race. That is dated the next day, and so many of the strips were built around trying to build those predictions and find those predictions that it wouldn't necessarily be an enthralling read, even if it wasn't for all the other problems. So it's not that surprising there were never book collections, but still, that hasn't been around to keep the strip in people's minds. After Ken Kling died, his son Woody revived the strip, and while Woody had a long career in entertainment, from writing for Milton Berle's show in the 1950s to the Cabbage Patch Kids in the 1980s, and winning Emmys for his work on the Carol Burnett show, he was unable to make the world care about these two gamblers. The New York newspaper he revived it for went out of business after less than a year after he revived the strip, taking Joe and his besties with it to the great recycling pile in the sky in February 1972. The last thing he did with the characters was a simple trademark renewal in 1984. But the lack of a commonly accessible record of the strip doesn't mean that it didn't have some importance and even some influence. In an upcoming issue of Hogan's Alley magazine, I'll have an article on Rusty the Rabbit, a strip that copied the horse race prediction aspect. And that's it for this episode of Comic Show and Tell with Nat Gertler. Thank you so much for spending your time with me. Please click the like button and subscribe button, and go read some comics.